Welcome to Sanctified Secrets. Before we dive into this gripping historical drama, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the shocking twists that await in this true-to-life story of power, resistance, and moral reckoning in the antebellum South. The morning mist clung to the cypress trees like the ghosts of Louisiana's past, shrouding Belmont Plantation in an ethereal veil that seemed to whisper of secrets better left buried. The year was 1847, and the grand estate stretched across thousands of acres of fertile delta land, its white-columned mansion standing as a monument to wealth built upon the backs of human bondage. Melanie Darcy stood at the tall windows of her late husband's study, now hers by right of widowhood. At 38, she possessed a beauty that grief had sharpened rather than diminished. High cheekbones carved by sorrow, steel-gray eyes that had learned to show no mercy, and auburn hair pulled back in a severe chignon that spoke of her iron discipline. The black silk of her mourning dress rustled as she turned from the window, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence of the room. "Mrs. Darcy," came the hesitant voice of Ezra, the elderly house slave who had served the family for over 2 decades. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held a silver tray bearing the morning correspondence. "The overseer wishes to speak with you about the cotton harvest, ma'am." Melanie's gaze swept over the man with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned to see people as assets rather than souls. "Tell Mr. Bogart I'll see him after I've attended to more pressing matters," she replied, her voice carrying the cultured accent of New Orleans aristocracy tinged with newfound authority. "And Ezra, send Clara to me immediately." The old man's eyes flickered with something that might have been concern, but he knew better than to question the mistress of Belmont. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, bowing his head as he retreated from the study. Madeline returned to the mahogany desk that had once belonged to her husband, Charles. 6 months had passed since yellow fever had claimed him, leaving her to manage not only the vast plantation, but also their 2 sons, Phipe, 22, and Henry, 19. Both young men had inherited their father's refined features and gentle disposition, qualities that had served Charles well in the drawing rooms of New Orleans, but proved woefully inadequate for the harsh realities of plantation life. The sound of soft footsteps on the Persian carpet announced Clara's arrival. Melanie looked up to see the young woman standing in the doorway, her posture erect despite the circumstances of her bondage. Clara was perhaps 20 years old, with skin the color of café au lait and eyes that held depths Melanie found both fascinating and unsettling. Unlike the other enslaved women on the plantation, Clara carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost defiant, though she was careful never to cross the line into open rebellion. "You sent for me, Mrs. Darcy." Clara's voice was soft but clear, educated, a result of having been raised in the house rather than the fields. Melanie studied the young woman for a long moment, her mind calculating with the same precision she applied to crop yields and market prices. Clara wore a simple gray dress that, despite its plainness, could not disguise her natural grace. Her hair was neatly braided and pinned, and her hands, though calloused from work, were elegant and expressive. "Clara," Melanie began, rising from behind the desk to pace slowly around the room, "you've been in this house since you were a child. You understand the delicate nature of our family's position." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, though her eyes betrayed a weariness that Melanie chose to ignore. "My sons," Melanie continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "are at a crucial stage in their development. They require guidance in matters that I, as their mother, cannot provide. They need to understand the natural order of things, the proper relationship between master and property." Clara's hands clenched slightly at her sides, but she remained silent. Melanie stopped directly in front of the young woman, close enough to see the slight tremor in her breathing. "You will attend to their needs, Clara, all of their needs. You will teach them what it means to command, and you will learn what it means to obey without question." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara's serene expression never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of steel that Melanie mistook for submission. "Do you understand what I'm asking of you?" Melanie pressed, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Darcy," Clara replied, her tone so level it was almost musical. "You want me to help your sons become the men you believe they need to be." "Exactly," Melanie smiled, a cold expression that never reached her eyes. "You'll begin tonight. Phipe will be expecting you in his chambers after dinner." As Clara curtsied and turned to leave, Melanie felt a surge of satisfaction. She had solved two problems with one decision. Her sons would learn to assert their authority, and Clara would be reminded of her place in the natural order. What Melanie failed to recognize was that she had just lit a fuse that would eventually consume everything she held dear. The rest of the day passed in a blur of plantation business. Melanie met with the overseer about the cotton harvest, reviewed the household accounts, and supervised the preparation of dinner. But beneath her efficient exterior, she found herself thinking about Clara's reaction, or rather the lack of one. Most of the enslaved women would have wept or pleaded. Clara had simply accepted her fate with an equanimity that was somehow more disturbing than tears would have been. As evening approached, Melanie summoned her sons to the parlor. Phipe and Hri Darcy were handsome young men, but their beauty was of the delicate, almost feminine variety that had become fashionable among the Creole aristocracy. Phipe the elder had inherited his mother's gray eyes and his father's sensitive mouth. Hri was darker with chestnut hair and a dreamy expression that suggested he spent more time with poetry than practical matters. "Mother," Philip said as he entered the parlor, his voice carrying the slight lisp that had persisted since childhood. "You wish to see us?" Melanie gestured for them to sit on the silk-upholstered sofa while she remained standing, a position that emphasized her authority. "I've made arrangements for your education to continue in a more practical direction," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Clara will be attending to your needs from now on." Henry looked puzzled. "Clara, but mother, she already helps with our laundry." "And not those needs," Melanie interrupted sharply. "You're men now, or you should be. It's time you learned to exercise the authority that is your birthright." Philippe's pale cheeks flushed pink as understanding dawned. "Mother, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what you think I mean," Melanie said firmly. "Your father was too gentle with you both. The world will not be so kind. You must learn to take what is yours by right, to command without hesitation or guilt." The two young men exchanged glances, a silent communication that had developed between them since childhood. Ari's romantic nature recoiled from the idea while Philip struggled with the expectations placed upon him as the heir to Belmont. "What if we refuse?" Ori asked quietly, his voice barely audible. Melanie's expression hardened. "Then you will prove yourselves unworthy of the Darcy name and everything your ancestors built. Clara is property, nothing more. If you cannot master a slave, how can you hope to master a plantation, a business, a wife?" The logic was brutal but effective. Philip straightened his shoulders, trying to summon the authority his mother demanded. "Very well, mother. If this is what you believe is necessary." Henry said nothing, but the conflict in his dark eyes was evident to anyone who cared to look. Melanie, however, saw only what she wanted to see: compliance. As the evening wore on and dinner was served in the grand dining room, Clara moved through her duties with her usual quiet efficiency. She served the soup course, refilled wine glasses and cleared plates, all while maintaining the serene expression that had become her trademark. But those who knew her well, Ezra, the cook, Mommy Rose, and the other house slaves, noticed subtle changes. Her movements were more deliberate, her silences more profound, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. After dinner, as the family retired to their respective chambers, Clara made her way up the grand staircase to Philippa's room. The hallway was dimly lit by oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on the walls, lined with portraits of Darcy ancestors. Each painted face seemed to watch her progress with expressions of stern disapproval, as if they knew what was about to transpire. She paused outside Philip's door, her hand raised to knock. For a moment the mask of serenity slipped, revealing the young woman beneath, frightened, angry, but not broken. Then she composed herself, knocked softly, and entered when bid. Phipe stood by the window, still dressed in his dinner clothes but with his cravat loosened. He turned as she entered, and she could see the conflict written across his features, desire warring with conscience, authority struggling against his natural gentleness. Clara, he said softly, his voice uncertain. My mother says that you're two, that we're two. I know what your mother expects, Clara replied, closing the door behind her. The question is, what do you expect, Mr. Fipe? The question hung between them like a challenge. Fipe had been raised to command, but he had also been raised to be a gentleman. The two imperatives seemed impossible to reconcile. I don't know, he admitted, his honesty surprising them both. I've never, that is, I don't wish to force. Clara stepped closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. Your mother believes that taking what you want will make you strong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But perhaps true strength lies in choosing what you take and what you leave untouched. Philip stared at her, seeing not just a beautiful slave, but a person with thoughts and feelings as complex as his own. It was a realization that would prove more dangerous to the established order than any act of rebellion. What would you have me do? He asked, the question revealing more vulnerability than he intended. Clara smiled then, an expression so gentle and knowing that it transformed her face entirely. I would have you be the man you choose to be, not the man your mother demands. As the night deepened around Belmont Plantation, the first seeds of change were planted. Maylene Darcy slept peacefully in her bed, believing she had secured her family's future through the exercise of absolute power. But in Philip's chamber, a different kind of education was beginning, one that would ultimately challenge everything the Darcy dynasty stood for. The old order was about to face its greatest test, not from external forces or economic pressures, but from the quiet revolution of human conscience awakening to its own moral contradictions. 3 weeks had passed since Mélane's decree, and the atmosphere at Belmont had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. The morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss draped over the ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows across the plantation grounds, where enslaved workers moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision born of generations of bondage. In the kitchen house, separated from the main mansion by a covered walkway, Mammy Rose kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary. Her dark hands, gnarled from decades of service, worked the dough as if it were her frustrations made manifest. At 63, she had seen 3 generations of Darcys come and go, and she possessed the keen insight that came from a lifetime of observing the White family's secrets while remaining invisible to them. That girl's playing with fire, she muttered to Ezra, who sat at the wooden table polishing silver, walking around here like she got some kind of power over them boys. Ezra looked up from the candlestick he was buffing, his rheumy eyes reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom. Maybe she do, he said quietly. Maybe she got the only power that matters, the power to make them see themselves clear. Hush your mouth, Mommy Rose hissed, glancing toward the door. You know better than to talk such foolishness. That kind of thinking get us all sold down river. But even as she spoke, both servants knew that something fundamental had changed in the house. Clara moved through her duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was a new quality to her presence, a subtle confidence that seemed to emanate from within. She no longer avoided eye contact with the family members, and when she spoke, her words carried a weight that demanded attention. In the main house, Mélane sat in her morning room reviewing correspondence from her factory in New Orleans. Cotton prices were holding steady, but there were disturbing reports of abolitionist activity increasing in the North. She frowned as she read about slave rebellions in other states, making mental notes to increase security measures at Belmore. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting to see one of the house servants. Instead, Philip stepped into the room, his appearance disheveled in a way that would have been scandalous in New Orleans society. His usually perfectly groomed hair was tousled, his crease skew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Philip," Mélane said, setting down her letters. "You look terrible. Are you ill?" Her elder son moved to the window, staring out at the gardens where Clara could be seen hanging laundry on the line. "I need to speak with you about Clara," he said without preamble. Mélane's eyebrows rose. "Oh, I trust she's been satisfactory in her duties." Philip turned from the window, and Mélane was startled by the intensity in his gray eyes. She's remarkable, he said simply. Intelligent, thoughtful, kind. Mother, did you know she can read not just simple words but actual literature? She's been teaching herself from the books in Father's library. That's quite enough, Meline said sharply, rising from her chair. I don't care about her accomplishments. She's property, Fipe. Nothing more. I hope you haven't forgotten that fundamental fact. How can I forget it when you remind me constantly? Philippa shot back, his voice carrying an edge of defiance that Meline had never heard before. But what if we're wrong? What if the system we've built our lives upon is fundamentally flawed? The words hung in the air like blasphemy. Meline stared at her son as if he had suddenly sprouted horns. Philip Darcy, you will not speak such treasonous nonsense in this house. Your father and grandfather built this plantation through hard work and proper understanding of the natural order. Negroes are children incapable of governing themselves. It is our burden and our duty to provide them with structure and purpose. Is it Philip challenged, or is it simply convenient for us to believe that? Clara speaks 3 languages, Mother. She understands mathematics, philosophy, even music. How does that fit with your theory of natural inferiority? Meline's face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. You're being manipulated by a clever slave who knows exactly how to appeal to your softer nature. This is precisely why I arranged for her to attend to you, to teach you to master such misguided sympathies. The only thing she's taught me is that I've been living a lie, Philip said quietly. We all have. Before Meline could respond, Henry appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. Mother Fipe, I need to speak with both of you. It's about Clara. Meline's heart sank as she saw the same conflicted expression on Henry's face that had been troubling Fipe. What about her? Henry entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. Last night when she came to my chambers, we talked, really talked. She told me about her family, how they were separated when she was 8 years old. Her mother was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, her father to one in Alabama. She hasn't seen them since. Henry, Meline warned. You're allowing yourself to be swayed by sob stories designed to she wasn't trying to gain my sympathy, Henry interrupted, his voice stronger than usual. She was simply answering my questions. I asked her about her life and she told me. Do you know what she said when I asked if she hated us? Meline and Fipe waited in tense silence. She said she couldn't afford to hate us because hatred would consume her soul, and her soul was the only thing she truly owned. Then she asked me what I thought my soul was worth. The question seemed to echo in the elegant morning room, challenging the very foundations upon which the Darcy family had built their identity. Meline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she refused to acknowledge the earthquake her own actions had triggered. Enough, she said firmly. Both of you are allowing yourselves to be manipulated by a slave who is clearly more cunning than I gave her credit for. This ends now. Clara will be reassigned to field work immediately. No, Philip said, the word cutting through the air with surprising force. Madeline stared at her son in shock. I beg your pardon, I said. No, Mother, you will not punish Clara for our awakening to the truth. If you send her to the fields, I'll follow her there, and I'll join him, Henry added, moving to stand beside his brother. For the first time in her adult life, Meline Darcy found herself facing open rebellion from her own children. The irony was not lost on her. In trying to teach them to master others, she had somehow lost mastery over them. You're both being ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. This infatuation will pass. Clara is a slave, and slaves exist to serve. That is the natural order of things. Whose nature? Philly asked. Yours, mine, or the nature that created us all as human beings with equal souls? The philosophical challenge was more than Meline could bear. She had been raised in a world where such questions were never asked, where the hierarchy of race and class was as fixed as the movement of the stars. To question, it was to question everything she had ever believed about herself and her place in the world. Get out, she said quietly. Both of you, get out of my sight before I say something I'll regret. The 2 young men exchanged glances and left the room, leaving Meline alone with her thoughts and her growing fear that the world she had known was crumbling around her. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters behind the main house, Clara sat on the steps of her small cabin, mending a tear in one of Henner's shirts. The irony of the task was not lost on her. She was literally repairing the fabric of her oppressor's life, while simultaneously unraveling the fabric of his worldview. Mommy Rose approached, her heavy footsteps announcing her presence long before she spoke. "Child, you need to be careful." The mistress got that look in her eye, the one that means trouble for folks like us. Clara looked up from her sewing, her serene expression unchanged. "I know, Mommy Rose, but I can't unknow what I know now, and neither can they." "What you talking about, girl?" Clara set down the shirt and looked toward the main house, where she could see Fipe and Henry walking in the garden, deep in conversation. "They're good men, Mammy Rose. Underneath all the poison they've been fed about who they're supposed to be, they're good men, and good men can't live with evil once they truly see it. You think you can change them?" Mammy Rose asked skeptically. "Change the whole system with your pretty words and gentle ways?" "I don't think I can change anything," Clara replied honestly. "But I think they can change themselves if they choose to. And that choice, that's where real power lies." As if summoned by their conversation, Fipe appeared at the edge of the slave quarters, his presence causing several of the enslaved workers to look up in surprise. It was unusual for the young master to venture into their domain. "Clara," he called softly, "might I speak with you?" She rose gracefully, aware of the eyes upon them both. "Of course, Mr. Fipe." They walked together toward the old oak tree that stood at the boundary between the slave quarters and the main grounds, its massive trunk scarred by decades of storms but still standing strong. "I've been thinking about what you said," Philip began, his voice uncertain. "About choosing what kind of man I want to be. And what have you decided?" Clara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Fipe stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I've decided that I don't want to be the kind of man who owns other human beings. I don't want to inherit a fortune built on suffering. I want to be better than that." Clara studied his face, seeing the sincerity there but also the fear. "That's a dangerous decision, Mr. Fipe. Your mother won't understand. Your neighbors will shun you. You'll lose everything you've been raised to expect." "Will I?" Fipe asked. "Or will I finally gain something worth having, a clear conscience and the respect of people whose opinions actually matter?" Before Clara could respond, they heard the sound of approaching hoof-beats. A rider was coming up the main drive at a gallop, dust clouds marking his urgent passage. Philip and Clara hurried toward the main house, arriving just as the rider dismounted. It was James Bogard, the plantation overseer, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Mrs. Darcy," he called as he bounded up the front steps. "Mrs. Darcy, you need to hear this." Melanie appeared on the veranda, her face composed despite the morning's emotional turmoil. "What is it, Mr. Bogard?" "News from New Orleans. Mom, there's been another slave uprising in Virginia. Nat Turner's rebellion has inspired others. The authorities are cracking down hard, but there's talk of abolitionists helping slaves escape to the north." Melanie's face palled. "How close is this unrest?" "Hard to say, ma'am, but the word is spreading. Some of the plantation owners are talking about selling off their most intelligent slaves, the ones who might cause trouble." Philippa felt Clara tense beside him, though her expression remained carefully neutral. The implication was clear. Slaves like Clara, who could read and think and inspire others, were now seen as particularly dangerous. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Beauregard." Melanie said, "Please increase the patrols and make sure all the slaves are accounted for at night." As the overseer rode away, Melanie's gaze fell upon Fipe and Clara standing together beneath the oak tree. The sight filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with distant rebellions and everything to do with the revolution taking place within her own family. The battle lines were being drawn, and Melanie Darcy was beginning to realize that the enemy might not be outside agitators or rebellious slaves, but the very conscience she had tried so hard to suppress in her own sons. The second act of this drama was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than anyone yet realized. The humid Louisiana air hung heavy with the promise of a storm as August drew to a close. For 6 weeks now, the delicate balance at Bellamont Plantation had been shifting like sand beneath the tide, and Madeline Darcy could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She stood in her late husband's study, now permanently hers, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning from her brother-in-law in New Orleans. The news it contained was both expected and devastating. Rumors of the Darcy sons' peculiar sympathies had reached the ears of New Orleans society. Invitations were being quietly withdrawn, business partnerships questioned, and the family's reputation built over 3 generations was hanging by a thread. "Damn them both," she whispered, crumpling the letter in her fist. "Damn their weak hearts and their father's gentle blood." A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Come," she called, expecting Ezra with the afternoon meal. Instead, Clara entered the room, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. Melanie's eyes narrowed as she studied the young woman who had become the unwitting catalyst for her family's destruction. Clara moved with the same quiet grace as always, but there was something different about her now, a subtle confidence that seemed to radiate from within. "I didn't request tea," Melanie said coldly. "No, Mom," Clara replied, setting the tray on the mahogany desk, "but I thought you might need it. You've seemed troubled lately." The audacity of the statement took Melanie's breath away. "Troubled? You think I'm troubled?" Her voice rose with each word. "You've destroyed my family, turned my sons against everything they were raised to believe, and you think I'm merely troubled." Clara poured the tea with steady hands, her serene expression never wavering. "I haven't destroyed anything, Mrs. Darcy. I've simply existed as myself. If that existence has caused problems, perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with a system that requires people to deny their own humanity." Melanie's hand moved instinctively toward the small pistol she kept in the desk drawer, a lady's weapon, pearl-handled and deadly. "How dare you speak to me that way? How dare you stand in my husband's study and lecture me about humanity?" "Because someone must," Clara said quietly, meeting Melanie's furious gaze without flinching. "And because your sons have found the courage to question what they've been taught, even if you haven't." The words hit Melanie like physical blows. She had spent months trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong, how her simple plan to toughen her sons had instead awakened their consciences. Now, looking at Clara's calm face, she finally understood the truth she had been avoiding. The problem wasn't that Clara was too clever or manipulative. The problem was that she was undeniably, unmistakably human. "You think you've won," Melanie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you've turned my boys against me with your pretty words and your tragic stories. But you've forgotten something crucial, Clara. You're still my property. You still belong to me." "Do I?" Clara asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or do I belong to myself as God intended? Your sons have begun to see the truth, Mrs. Darcy. The question is whether you're brave enough to see it too." Before Madeline could respond, the study door burst open and Phipe rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and determination. HRI followed close behind, both young men clearly agitated. "Mother," Philip said breathlessly, "we need to talk. Henry and I have made a decision." Melanie's heart sank as she saw the resolution in her sons' faces. "What decision?" Henry stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by surprising steel. "We're freeing the slaves, Mother, all of them. We're going to sell the plantation and use the proceeds to help them establish new lives as free people." The words hit Melanie like a physical blow. She staggered backward, gripping the edge of the desk for support. "You can't be serious. You can't simply. This plantation has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather built this empire from nothing. Built it on the backs of stolen people," Philip said firmly. "Built it on a foundation of human misery. We won't be part of that anymore." Melanie's gaze swung wildly between her sons and Clara, who stood quietly beside the tea service, her expression unreadable. "This is her doing," she said, pointing an accusatory finger. "She's poisoned your minds with abolitionist propaganda." "Clara has never spoken against slavery," Henry said quietly. "She's never had to. Her very existence is argument enough against the system that enslaves her." "Your children," Melanie spat, "naive children who don't understand the realities of the world. Without slavery, the South's economy would collapse. Thousands of white families would be ruined. The Negroes themselves would starve without our guidance and protection." Phipe shook his head sadly. "Listen to yourself, Mother. You're so convinced of your own righteousness that you can't see the evil right in front of you. We're not protecting anyone. We're perpetuating a system of cruelty that degrades everyone it touches, including us. Melanie felt the last of her control slipping away. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in was crumbling before her eyes. In desperation, she pulled the pistol from the desk drawer, pointing it directly at Clara. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "All of you get out. Clara, you have until sunset to leave this plantation. If I see you after dark, I'll shoot you as a runaway slave." Philip stepped protectively in front of Clara, his face pale but determined. "If you want to shoot her, you'll have to shoot me first." Henry moved to stand beside his brother, presenting a united front. "And me." Melanie stared at her sons, these young men she had raised, loved, and tried to mold in her own image, and saw strangers. They were willing to die for a slave, willing to throw away their birthright for the sake of an ideal she couldn't understand. "You're not my sons," she whispered, the pistol wavering in her trembling hand. "My sons would never betray their own blood for a Negro." "We're exactly your sons," Phipe said gently. "We're the men you raised us to be, even if we're not the men you wanted us to become. Father taught us to be kind, to be just, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. We're honoring his memory even if we're disappointing you." The mention of Charles broke something inside Melanie. She lowered the pistol, her shoulders sagging with defeat. "Your father was a good man," she admitted quietly. "Too good for this world, perhaps, too good for me." Clara stepped out from behind Phipe, her movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Darcy," she said softly, "it's not too late. You could choose to be the woman your husband believed you were. You could choose to see us as he saw us, as people worthy of freedom and dignity." For a moment, Melanie wavered. She looked at Clara's face, really looked at it, and saw not a piece of property, but a young woman with hopes and dreams and fears just like her own. She saw intelligence and kindness, and a strength that had endured years of bondage without breaking. But the moment passed. The weight of a lifetime's conditioning, the fear of losing everything she had known, the terror of admitting she had been wrong about something so fundamental, it was too much. "No," she said, her voice hollow. "I can't, I won't. This is my home, my life, my world. I won't let you destroy it." Philip and Henry exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "Then we'll leave," Philip said simply. "Tonight, all of us." "You can't," Melanie protested. "You're my heirs. This plantation will be yours someday." "We don't want it," Henry said firmly. "We'll make our own way in the world with clean hands and clear consciences." Indeed, as the three young people turned to leave, Melanie called out desperately, "Where will you go? What will you do? You have no money, no connections outside of Louisiana society." Philip paused at the door. "We'll go north to the Free States. We'll work. We'll build new lives, and we'll help others do the same." "You'll be outcasts," Melanie warned. "Paras, no decent society will accept you." Clara spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. "Perhaps it's time to find a new definition of decent society, Mrs. Darcy. One based on character rather than color, on humanity rather than hierarchy." As they left the study, Melanie sank into her husband's chair, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the floor. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the plantation continuing its daily routine. Slaves working in the fields, overseers calling out orders, the eternal cycle of oppression and resistance that had defined her world for as long as she could remember. But now that world felt hollow, empty of meaning. Her sons were gone, not just physically, but spiritually. They had chosen a different path, one that led away from everything she had taught them to value. As the sun began to set over the Louisiana Delta, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Melanie Darcy sat alone in her empty mansion, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the weight of her choices. She had tried to preserve her world by hardening her sons' hearts, but instead, she had lost them to the very compassion she had sought to destroy. The old order was dying, and she was its last lonely guardian. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening, when Philip, Henry, and Clara had disappeared into the Louisiana night, leaving Bellamont Plantation forever changed. The winter of 1848 had been harsh, not just in terms of weather, but in the cold reality of consequences that had settled over the once grand estate like a shroud. Madeline Darcy stood at the same window where she had first conceived her terrible plan. But the woman who gazed out at the frost-covered fields bore little resemblance to the iron-willed widow of months past. Her auburn hair had gone prematurely gray. Her face was gaunt from sleepless nights and poor appetite, and her once proud bearing had given way to a stooped posture that spoke of defeat. The plantation was dying. Without her sons to inherit it, and with the scandal of their abolitionist sympathies having spread throughout Louisiana society, Meline found herself increasingly isolated. Business partners had withdrawn their support. Neighboring plantation owners avoided her, and even the slaves seemed to sense the change in the air, working with less enthusiasm, whispering among themselves about freedom in the North. Ezra entered the study, carrying the morning mail, his aged hands trembling more than usual. At 70, he had served the Darcy family his entire life, and the uncertainty of the plantation's future weighed heavily on his mind. "Any word?" Meline asked without turning from the window, though they both knew what she was asking about. "No, Mom," Ezra replied softly. "No letters from the young masters." Meline nodded, unsurprised but still disappointed. She had written dozens of letters to Phipe and Ori, sending them to every major city in the North, but had received no replies. It was as if her sons had vanished from the earth, taking Clarara with them into a world she couldn't understand or follow. "There is something else, though," Ezra continued hesitantly. "A visitor says he's from the bank in New Orleans." Meline's heart sank. She had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since the cotton crop had failed to meet its projected yields and the plantation's debts had begun to mount. "Send him in," she said, finally turning from the window to face whatever news awaited her. The banker was a thin, nervous man named Tibito, who had clearly drawn the short straw when it came to delivering bad news to desperate plantation owners. He clutched his hat in his hands as he entered the study, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. "Mrs. Darcy," he began, his voice apologetic but firm, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news regarding your accounts. How much time do I have?" Meline asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Tibito blinked in surprise at her directness. That is to say, the bank is prepared to extend your credit for another 3 months, provided you can demonstrate a clear plan for repayment. And if I can't, then I'm afraid we'll have no choice but to foreclose on the property. The plantation would be sold at auction to satisfy your debts." Meline nodded slowly, having expected as much. "And the slaves, but they would be sold as well, of course, separately most likely, to maximize the return for creditors." The words hit Meline like a physical blow. She thought of Ezra, who had served her family faithfully for 7 decades, of Mommy Rose, who had nursed her sons through childhood illnesses, of the field hands, who had worked the Darcy land for generations. They would all be scattered to the winds, families separated, lives destroyed. For the first time since her sons had left, Meline truly understood what Philippe and Henri had been trying to tell her. The system she had defended so fiercely was not just morally wrong. It was also inherently unstable, built on a foundation of human misery that could collapse at any moment. After the banker left, Meline sat alone in the study, staring at the portrait of her late husband that hung above the fireplace. Charles Darcy gazed down at her with kind eyes, and she found herself wondering what he would have done in her situation. "You always were too gentle for this world," she whispered to the painting. "But perhaps that was your strength, not your weakness." A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Come," she called, expecting Ezra. Instead, Mammy Rose entered the room, her massive frame filling the doorway. The elderly cook had never before entered the master's study uninvited, and her presence here now spoke to the extraordinary circumstances they all faced. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Darcy," Mammy Rose said, her voice respectful but determined. "But I heard about the banker's visit. The whole quarters is talking about what's going to happen to us." Meline looked at the woman who had been a constant presence in her life for over 20 years. "I'm sorry, Rose, I've failed you all." "No, ma'am," Mommy Rose said firmly, "you ain't failed us. You just been trying to hold on to something that was already broken. But maybe it ain't too late to do right." "What do you mean?" Mommy Rose stepped closer, her dark eyes intense with purpose. "I mean, maybe you could do what your boys wanted to do. Free us, all of us, before the bank takes everything." Meline stared at the older woman in shock. "Free you?" "Rose, I don't have the money to help you establish new lives. I can barely keep food on the table. We don't need your money, Mrs. Darcy. We just need our papers. Our freedom papers. Most of us got family up north, people who escaped or were freed. We can make our own way if we just got the legal right to do it." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Melanie had spent her entire adult life believing that the slaves depended on her for everything: food, shelter, purpose. The thought that they might be capable of caring for themselves, of building their own lives, challenged everything she had been taught to believe. "The neighbors would never forgive me," Melanie said weakly. "I'd be completely ostracized." "You already are," Mammy Rose pointed out gently. "Might as well be ostracized for doing right instead of doing wrong." That evening, Melanie walked through the slave quarters for the first time in years. She had always viewed this area of the plantation from a distance, seeing it as a necessary but distasteful part of the operation. Now moving among the small cabins where families lived in cramped conditions, she began to see the human cost of her comfortable lifestyle. Children played in the dirt between the cabins, their laughter a bright note in the gathering dusk. Women sat on their porches mending clothes or preparing simple meals over open fires. Men returned from the fields, their faces etched with exhaustion, but still managing to smile at their families. These were not the childlike dependents she had been taught to see, but complex human beings with their own hopes, dreams, and relationships. They had built a community within the confines of their bondage, creating meaning and joy despite the circumstances of their lives. At the far end of the quarters, she found Ezra sitting on his porch, whittling a small wooden toy for one of the children. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face showing surprise at her presence. "Mrs. Darcy," he said, starting to rise, "is there something you need?" "Sit, Ezra," she said gently. "I wanted to ask you something. If you were free, truly free, what would you do?" The old man's eyes widened at the unexpected question. "I don't rightly know, ma'am. Never really let myself think about such things." "Think about it now," Melanie encouraged. "If you could go anywhere, do anything, what would make you happy?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gnarled hand still working the piece of wood. "I got a daughter," he said finally, "sold away when she was just 16. Last I heard, she was in Philadelphia working as a seamstress. If I was free," he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "If I was free, I'd like to see her again. Meet my grandchildren." Melanie felt tears prick her eyes. "What's her name?" "Sarah," Ezra said softly. "Sarah Johnson, she calls herself now. Got herself a good husband from what I hear. A free man. How do you know all this?" Ezra looked uncomfortable. "There's ways of getting word, ma'am. The Underground Railroad, they call it. People helping folks find their families, sending messages." Britt, the revelation that there was an entire network of communication and assistance operating right under her nose, was another shock to Melanie's understanding of the world. The slaves weren't passive victims waiting for white guidance. They were active agents in their own lives, working toward freedom despite every obstacle placed in their path. Over the next several days, Melanie found herself having similar conversations with other slaves on the plantation. She learned about families separated by sales, about dreams deferred but not abandoned, about a resilience and dignity that had survived despite decades of oppression. The more she learned, the more she understood what her sons had tried to tell her. The system of slavery didn't just dehumanize the enslaved. It dehumanized the enslavers as well, forcing them to deny the obvious humanity of the people they claimed to own. On a cold February morning, exactly 7 months after Philip and HRI had left Ballure, Melanie made her decision. She gathered all the slaves in the main yard and stood before them, a stack of legal documents in her hands. "I have something to tell you all," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "As of today, you are all free. I've had the papers drawn up in New Orleans. You are no longer slaves, but free men and women with the right to go where you choose and live as you see fit." The silence that followed was profound. Some of the slaves looked skeptical, as if expecting this to be some cruel joke. Others began to weep openly. A few fell to their knees in prayer. "I know this doesn't undo the wrongs that have been done to you," Melanie continued, her own voice breaking with emotion. I know it doesn't give you back the years that were stolen from you or reunite you with family members who were sold away, but it's a beginning. It's a chance to build the lives you choose for yourselves. Ezra stepped forward, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Mrs. Darcy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why now?" Meline looked at the faces surrounding her, faces she had seen every day for years but had never really seen until now. "Because my sons were right," she said simply. "Because you deserve to be free. Because it's what my husband would have wanted, and because it's the right thing to do." In the weeks that followed, the former slaves of Bellamont Plantation began to scatter to the winds. Some headed north to reunite with family members. Others stayed in Louisiana, but moved to New Orleans or other cities where they could work for wages. A few, like Mommy Rose, chose to remain at the plantation temporarily to help Meline prepare for the inevitable auction. Ezra was among those who left for the north, carrying his freedom papers and a letter of introduction that Meline had written for him. On the day of his departure, he came to say goodbye, his few possessions packed in a small bundle. "I want you to know," he said, standing in the doorway of the study where he had served for so many years, "that despite everything there was kindness in this house. Your husband was a good man, and your boys, they got his heart." "And what about me?" Ezra, Meline asked. "Do I have any of his heart?" The old man smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "You freed us, didn't you? That took more courage than anything Master Charles ever did. He was born good. You had to choose to become good. That's harder and maybe more valuable." After Ezra left, Meline found herself truly alone for the first time in her life. The great house echoed with emptiness, its rooms too large and too quiet for one person. But in the silence she began to hear something she had never noticed before. The sound of her own conscience finally free to speak. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived that changed everything. It bore a Philadelphia postmark and was addressed in handwriting she recognized immediately. With trembling fingers, Meline opened the envelope and read, "Dearest Mother, we have heard through mutual friends of your decision to free the slaves at Bellamont. We cannot express how proud we are of your courage and your conscience. We know it could not have been an easy choice, and we know the cost to you personally has been great. We are writing to invite you to join us in Philadelphia, where we have established a small but growing business, helping former slaves reunite with their families and establish new lives. Clara has proven invaluable in this work, as her education and gentle manner help put frightened people at ease. We know we disappointed you by leaving as we did, and we know our choices have cost you dearly. But we hope that perhaps in time we might build something new together. A family based not on the ownership of others, but on love, respect, and shared purpose. If you are willing to consider a new life, a new beginning, we would welcome you with open arms. There is much work to be done in the cause of freedom, and we could use your strength and intelligence in the fight with all our love and respect. Philip and Henry P.S. Clara asked us to tell you that she forgives you and that she hopes you can forgive yourself. She says that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to seek it." Meline read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the desk. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the auction preparations. Men cataloging furniture, measuring rooms, preparing to sell off the remnants of the Darcy dynasty. But for the first time in months, Meline felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. She picked up her pen and began to write. "My dearest sons, yes, I will come. I will help. I will try to become the woman your father believed I could be and the mother you deserve to have. I cannot undo the past, but perhaps I can help build a better future. Perhaps we can all find redemption in the work of setting others free. Your loving mother, Madeline." As she sealed the letter, Meline looked once more at her husband's portrait. Charles Darcy seemed to be smiling down at her, his kind eyes full of approval and love. The old world was ending, but a new one was beginning. And for the first time in her life, Meline Darcy was ready to be part of building something better than what had come before. The price of freedom, she had learned, was not just the loss of what you thought you owned, but the courage to admit you had been wrong. It was a price she was finally willing to pay. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, spring 1850. The small office on Chestnut Street bore no outward sign of the revolutionary work taking place within its modest walls. To passers-by, It appeared to be nothing more than another business establishment in the bustling commercial district of Philadelphia. But inside the Freedom Foundation, as Phipe, Henry, and Clara had named their organization, was quietly changing lives one family at a time. Melanie Darcy sat at a simple wooden desk, her once elegant hands now ink-stained from hours of correspondence. At 42, she looked older than her years, but there was a peace in her face that had been absent during her years as mistress of Bellamont. Her hair, now completely silver, was pulled back in a practical style, and she wore a simple gray dress that would have scandalized her former social circle. "Mrs. Darcy," called Clara from across the room, where she was helping a young woman fill out paperwork. "We've received word from the conductor in Baltimore. The Johnson family made it safely to Canada." Melanie looked up from the letter she was writing and smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her features. "Wonderful news. That makes 37 families we've helped reunite this year. The work was dangerous and often heartbreaking. They helped former slaves locate family members sold away years or decades earlier, provided legal assistance to those seeking to establish their freedom in court, and occasionally aided in the more clandestine activities of the Underground Railroad. It was illegal, socially unacceptable, and absolutely necessary." Philippe entered the office carrying a stack of newspapers, his face grim. "The Fugitive Slave Act passed," he announced, setting the papers on the central table. "It's official now. Even free states are required to return escaped slaves to their owners." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The new federal law meant that their work had become even more dangerous, and that formerly safe havens in the North were no longer secure. Henry looked up from the financial ledgers he was reviewing. "What does this mean for our families in Philadelphia? For people like the Johnsons?" "It means we adapt," Clara said firmly, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had once challenged the foundations of Bellamont Plantation. "It means we find new ways to help, new routes to safety, new methods of resistance." Melanie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. "It also means that more people will begin to see the true face of slavery," she said thoughtfully. "When Northern citizens are forced to participate in the capture and return of human beings, when they see families torn apart on their own doorsteps, perhaps more will join our cause." It was a prescient observation. The Fugitive Slave Act would indeed galvanize Northern opposition to slavery in ways that decades of abolitionist rhetoric had failed to achieve. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Philippe opened it to reveal Ezra, now 73, but still spry, his face beaming with joy. Behind him stood a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands. Clearly a working woman, but dressed in the simple finery of someone celebrating a special occasion. "Mrs. Darcy," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Sarah." Melanie felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched the reunion she had helped make possible. Sarah Johnson, for she had indeed taken her husband's name, embraced her father with a tenderness that spoke of years of separation and the miracle of being together again. "Thank you," Sarah said, turning to address the room. "All of you. My father told me what you've done, how you've helped so many families find each other again. I can never repay such a gift." "Your freedom is payment enough," Madeline replied, meaning every word. "Your happiness, your family's future. That's all the reward we need." As the afternoon wore on, more visitors arrived. Former slaves seeking help locating family members, free blacks needing legal assistance, and occasionally white allies offering support or information. The office buzzed with activity, a hub of hope in a world still largely defined by oppression. Near closing time, as the last visitors departed and the staff began organizing papers for the next day, Clara approached Melanie's desk. "I wanted to thank you," Clara said quietly, "for the letter you wrote to the newspaper last week. Your testimony about life on a plantation coming from someone who owned slaves carries weight that our words never could." Melanie looked up from her correspondence. "It was the least I could do. I spent years perpetuating lies about the natural order and the contentment of enslaved people. If my voice can now serve the truth, then perhaps some good can come from all those years of willful blindness." Clara sat down in the chair across from the desk, her expression thoughtful. Do you ever regret it, giving up your old life, your position in society? Madeline considered the question seriously. I regret the years I wasted living a lie, she said finally. I regret the pain I caused, the opportunities for kindness I missed, but regret leaving that life behind. Never. I sleep better now than I ever did as mistress of Bellamont. And your sons, are you proud of the men they've become? A smile crossed Meline's face as she looked across the room where Philip and Henry were helping an elderly man write a letter to relatives in Canada. They're better men than I ever dared hope they could be. They chose conscience over comfort, justice over privilege. They're their father's sons in the best possible way. As evening fell over Philadelphia, the small staff of the Freedom Foundation prepared to close for the day. But their work would continue through the night as conductors on the Underground Railroad guided desperate families toward freedom. As letters carried messages between separated loved ones, and as the quiet revolution of human conscience continued to spread, outside the gas light flickered on the cobblestone streets, illuminating a city that was itself a symbol of freedom and possibility. But inside the modest office on Chestnut Street, a different kind of light burned. The light of redemption, of second chances, and of the unshakable belief that people could change, that systems could be challenged, and that love could triumph over hatred. Madeleine gathered her shawl and prepared to walk to the small boarding house where she now lived, a far cry from the grand mansion of her past, but infinitely more honest. As she reached the door, she paused to look back at the office that had become her life's true work. On the wall hung a simple wooden plaque that Philip had carved, bearing words that had become their unofficial motto. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Below it, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small djere, a photograph of the four of them taken the previous Christmas. Meline, Phipe, Henry, and Clara standing together not as master and slaves, not as owner and property, but as family, as equals, as human beings united in common cause. The old world of Bellamont Plantation was gone forever, swept away by the tide of history and the courage of those who dared to imagine something better. In its place, something new was growing, fragile still, and facing enormous challenges, but rooted in truth rather than lies, in love rather than fear. As Meline stepped out into the Philadelphia evening, she carried with her the knowledge that redemption was indeed possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from holding on to power, but from having the courage to let it go. The seeds of change planted in the rich soil of awakened conscience were beginning to bloom, and though the harvest was still years away, the promise of freedom, true freedom for all, had never seemed more real or more achievable. The darkest secret of Belmont Plantation had been transformed into the brightest hope of a new generation, and in that transformation lay the proof that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, could withstand the power of human beings choosing to see each other as they truly were, children of the same God, deserving of the same dignity, capable of the same love. The story of the Darcy family was ending, but the story of freedom was just beginning. If this story of redemption and resistance moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with others who believe in the power of human conscience to overcome even the darkest chapters of our past. Together, we can ensure that these stories of courage and transformation continue to inspire future generations to choose justice over comfort and love over fear. What did you think of Meline's journey from oppressor to ally? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other historical stories of transformation you'd like to see explored. Remember, the arc of the moral universe may be long, but each of us has the power to help it bend toward justice.